"You can't put that name on the stone. Not here. Not in this cemetery." Those were the first words spoken when Luther Dane arrived at the gravesite, holding the engraved marble slab that bore his brother's name. Calvin James Dane, 1949 to 1971, U.S. Army, 3rd Infantry Division, Purple Heart, Bronze Star. Never forgotten, finally home. The words cut through the still morning air like a rusted blade, coated not in blood, but in decades of contempt. The man who spoke them was Sheriff Jeb Derlin, a man whose family had run Eden Falls County for 3 generations. He stood on the edge of the grass with his chest puffed like he was guarding Arlington, as if the memory of black soldiers might somehow stain the soil. "You hear me, old man? That grave isn't for your kind." Luther, 76, wiry, sun-darkened, and dressed in a clean flannel shirt tucked into faded jeans, said nothing at first. His hands were shaking, not from fear or weakness, but the sheer effort of holding back a lifetime of fury. "You see this stone?" he said quietly, holding the base of the marker in both hands. "I've carried it 600 miles from Fort Stillwater, where the Army finally gave my brother back to me. I carried it, I cleaned it, I paid for it with the pension I earned working steel and surviving 2 tours, and now you're telling me he can't rest here?" Derlin narrowed his eyes. "This is private ground, family-owned since 1892. Not everyone qualifies." "Not everyone qualifies?" Luther repeated, his voice low. "You mean black?" "Don't start that," Derlin snapped. "This isn't about race, it's about rules. The association has standards." "Show me," Luther interrupted. "Show me the page that says a soldier who died for this country doesn't qualify to line next to his mother." Derlin hesitated. His deputy, younger, nervous, visibly unsure, shifted behind him. "You don't want to make this a scene. I'll have to call in a removal order if you try and bury that stone." Luther looked at the dirt where the casket was due to be lowered in 2 hours. The spot had already been dug, a modest opening beneath the sycamore tree Calvin used to climb when they were boys. Then he looked back at the sheriff. "I've buried men overseas in worse dirt than this. You go ahead and call whoever you need to, but this stone is going in that ground, and I dare you to stop me." The police cruiser showed up 20 minutes later. 2 officers stepped out, both white, both young, and both looked like they'd rather be anywhere else than walking into what was quickly becoming national news. Because by now, someone had already started recording. A neighbor across the fence, a teenager from a nearby house, a woman in a blue dress who used to go to church with Calvin and Luther's mother. Their phones were up, their voices low but clear. One of them whispered, "He fought in Vietnam, and they won't even let him rest next to his mama." The news spread faster than pollen on the wind, and still Luther stood, beside the hole in the earth, beside the headstone he had polished that very morning. Sheriff Derlin had moved to the side to talk to the officers, gesturing animatedly, pointing at Luther, shaking his head like he was explaining a trespasser who'd set fire to the mayor's lawn. "Don't let him intimidate you," Derlin said. "He's just trying to make a scene." Officer Reynolds, the taller of the two, adjusted his belt and looked over at Luther, who hadn't moved. "Sir," Reynolds said as he approached, "I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the gravesite." "No," Luther replied. Reynolds blinked. "Sir." "You heard me." Luther's voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It had the weight of something ancient, something earned, something cut from decades of being told no, of being denied dignity, opportunity, presence. "My brother's coming home today. You don't get to stop that." "Mr. Dane," the second officer interjected, "the sheriff claims this is private property and that your permit to bury your brother here was issued in error." Luther turned to them slowly. "Let me ask you something. How many permits you think white boys needed to get buried here since 1892? The officers didn't answer. Exactly, he said. This land, this dirt, was worked by men like my father, my uncle. Hell, my brother picked pecans from that tree before he ever picked up a rifle. And now, after 47 years in a body bag stored under the wrong name because some bureaucrat couldn't be bothered to check, you want me to go bury him in the woods like a stray dog? The young officers shifted uncomfortably. Sir, we're just trying to de-escalate. Then de-escalate by standing down. And then, as if summoned by fate itself, a rumble in the distance grew louder. A long black car rounded the bend of the cemetery path, followed by 3 more. It was the procession. The military escort had arrived. At the front, a hearse. Inside it, the casket of Calvin James Dane. Behind it, a federal escort vehicle. Inside that, a man in uniform, and not just any uniform. Lieutenant General Raymond Miles, 3 stars on his shoulder, and a fury in his eyes. He stepped out of the car, adjusted his white gloves, and walked directly toward the crowd. Sirs, stand down. This burial is happening under full federal sanction. Sheriff Derlin puffed up. General, I don't care who you are. I don't care what you care about, Sheriff, the general snapped. That man, he said, pointing to Luther, carried a promise this country broke. He's been denied enough. But this is private. You think valor stops at a property line? General Miles barked. You think sacrifice expires because a man has the wrong color skin when he dies? The sheriff faltered. You've got about 5 minutes to clear your men and your mouth off this land, or I will bring a congressional investigation so far down your throat your grandchildren will be testifying before a Senate committee. The 2 officers, frozen, exchanged glances, then quietly turned and walked back to their cruiser. Sheriff Derlin stood alone. And then, realizing the cameras were still rolling, he turned and left, muttering curses under his breath. The general turned to Luther. Elijah told me you might need help, he said quietly. Luther nodded once. I didn't ask, he replied. No, Miles said, but you earned it. Then the general saluted, and Luther, eyes glassy, returned the salute. The next 45 minutes were unlike anything the town of Eden Falls had ever seen. The flag was folded, the rifle volley fired, the trumpet wept. And when the stone was finally set, just as the sun dropped below the tree line, a single line from the ceremony lingered in the hush. He came home not to be honored, but to remind us what we forgot. Luther remained after the others left, kneeling. His hand rested on the headstone. He whispered something no one heard, and then he stood, straight-backed, unyielding, like stone. 2 days after the burial, Luther received a letter. It came in a plain white envelope, hand-delivered by a young woman in army dress uniform who refused to say her name. She handed it to him with a stiff nod, then turned and walked away without explanation. Inside was a single page, typed, stamped with the seal of the Department of Defense. This is the original documentation of Corporal Calvin James Dane's internment status. The record has been amended. His sacrifice is now officially acknowledged. Effective immediately, his name will be added to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall in Washington, D.C. It was signed by the Secretary of the Army, and it brought Luther no comfort, because it came 52 years too late. He folded the letter slowly, hands trembling. Twice, he muttered. His niece, Elaine, sat across the room. Twice what, Uncle? They buried him twice, said Luther. First in a jungle, then in silence. The next day, Luther went to the courthouse. The Eden Falls Historical Records Office was a brick building with more cobwebs than staff. Most folks didn't come here unless they needed a death certificate or a building permit. He came for neither. "Can I help you?" asked the receptionist, a tired woman with a nameplate that read Helen Waller. "I need to see the veteran burial records," she said. She blinked. "You mean the county military archive? That's in the back, but you'll need—" Luther pulled out a small document, a court order signed by a federal judge authorizing him access to sealed local burial logs. Helen didn't ask further. 10 minutes later, Luther stood alone in a dusty storage room, boxes stacked high, most never touched since the Carter administration. He ran his hand along the labels. Burials, 1965 to 1975. He opened the box, found the file for 1971. His eyes scanned the list, and then he saw it. Dane, C.J. Status unknown. Record incomplete. Unconfirmed KIA. But there was more. A sticky note, faded but legible, written in ballpoint pen. Do not include in local veteran honors list. Cause of death contested. Possible misconduct. Luther's blood ran cold. He turned the page. There it was, a memo from the sheriff's office in 1972. Calvin Dane's remains were received at Dover AF but misidentified. Due to inconsistent details in service record and lack of next of kin claims, no burial arrangements made. Recommend file be closed quietly. Luther's jaw clenched. There had been no accident, no unfortunate mistake. They had scrubbed his brother from the record, not because they couldn't confirm his death, but because they didn't want to confirm his life. That night, Luther called a man he hadn't spoken to in nearly 2 decades, a journalist named Marcus Hayes, former Army intelligence turned investigative bulldog. "Marcus," Luther said, "I need a war reopened." 2 weeks later, Eden Falls was in the headlines. Vietnam hero erased from history by county bureaucracy. Body returned after 47 years. Family denied burial. Retired steelworker exposes suppression of black veterans' legacy. National networks picked it up. Congress members issued statements. A request was filed to rename Eden Falls Main Avenue Dane Way. But Luther didn't smile. Because behind the cameras and declarations, he saw something else. People started visiting the grave not because they remembered Calvin, but because they felt guilty. They brought flowers. They asked for forgiveness. Some cried. Most took pictures. None of them had spoken up when it mattered. At the Sunday church picnic, an old woman said, "We had no idea what really happened." Luther looked at her, tired. "You had every chance to ask." But amid the noise, one person stood out. An old man with pale skin and trembling hands showed up at the grave early one morning. No press, no fanfare, just him and a cane. Luther approached quietly. The man looked up. "You don't remember me," he said, "but I was there. 1971, Hugh City. I was in his squad. Calvin saved my life. Pulled me out when the building collapsed. I tried to tell them when I got stateside, but they told me his record was gone." Luther's voice cracked. What's your name? Staff Sergeant Leland Pierce. Retired, but only because of your brother. He handed Luther a photo. Faded, water-stained. 5 soldiers smiling in front of a burnt-out building. Calvin was in the middle, arms slung around 2 men. Pierce was one of them. I never forgot him, the man said. I just couldn't find him. Until now. Luther took the photo, and for the first time in weeks, he wept. The photo sat on Luther's mantelpiece now. It had been carefully cleaned, framed in dark oak, and placed beneath an old folded American flag that had never been presented. The flag was Calvin's, the one he was supposed to receive in 1971, the one no one ever delivered, because officially he didn't die a hero. He died complicated, and that's all it took to erase a life. After Pierce's visit, the letters started arriving. At first, 1 or 2, then a dozen, then over 70 in a single week. Some were from veterans, some from their children, some from people who'd never served, but who had stories of brothers, uncles, fathers, erased in silence because they were inconvenient, or because they didn't fit the mold, or because they were black. One letter read, "My grandfather was told his Bronze Star was pending review. He died before it ever arrived. We only found out 3 years ago that it had been approved but never mailed. Why? Because he was from South Memphis and didn't have the right connections. Calvin's story is my grandfather's story too." Another, "I'm a retired Marine. I never met Calvin Dane, but I heard his name once, whispers in training back in '92. They called him a ghost, said he saved a full squad in Hue and vanished. Now I know the truth. Thank you." And then came the invitation from the Pentagon. They wanted Luther to speak, to tell Calvin's story at a Memorial Day event, the national one, held on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. "I'm no speaker," he said, but Elaine, his niece, placed her hand on his shoulder. "You don't need to speak," she said. "You just need to carry the flag." On May 27th, Luther Dane stood before a crowd of more than 10,000 people. His legs trembled, his back ached, but his hands were steady. In one, the photograph of 5 soldiers. In the other, the flag they never raised. Behind him, a screen showed Calvin's face for the first time, not as a mugshot or a footnote, but as a soldier, a brother, a man. And when he walked to the podium, he didn't say much, just this: "I was told my brother didn't belong. I was told he wasn't buried properly because of some error. But let me be clear. The only error was in forgetting him. My brother fought in silence, died in silence, and was buried in silence. But today we break that silence, not just for him, but for every name they left off the wall." When he finished, the crowd stood, and the applause lasted for 5 full minutes. That night, Luther sat on the balcony looking out over the Potomac. He was quiet for a long time. Elaine sat beside him. "You think he heard it?" she asked. Luther nodded slowly. "Heard it, felt it, and finally rested." The next morning, they visited the wall, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. A long black slash in the earth, like a scar that never quite healed. They walked to panel 34E, row 68, and there it was, Calvin James Dane. Luther reached out, tracing the name with 2 fingers. For years, it didn't exist. Now it lived in granite, still unmovable. Back in Eden Falls, a motion passed unanimously to rename the town's civic hall Dane Memorial Center. And for the first time in the cemetery's 131-year history, a new section was designated, open to any veteran, regardless of race, background, or deed status. At the entrance, a plaque now stands. They tried to bury more than a body. They tried to bury the truth, but the truth has roots, and it grows. The wind was sharp on the day the cement dried. Luther stood alone at the edge of the cemetery, arms crossed over his coat, watching as the final sealant was brushed across the base of the new marker. Not just his brothers, but now surrounded by 5 others. They weren't all family, not by blood, but they had been like Calvin, forgotten, denied, discarded. Now their stones stood together. The words carved beneath their names were the same, erased no more. Word of Calvin Dane's story didn't fade after Memorial Day. In fact, it grew. College students started researching other cases. Veterans organizations dug into burial logs. More than 70 counties nationwide were found to have at least one case of an unrecognized soldier of color. Men who had died for their country and were denied the most basic honor of remembrance. And everywhere people asked, how many more? One documentary filmmaker called Luther, another called Elaine. A third asked for permission to interview Pierce, the soldier Calvin saved back in Hugh. I'm not the story, Pierce said. No, Luther agreed, but you carry it. Meanwhile, Sheriff Derlin quietly resigned. No press conference, no apology. Just a notice filed at midnight and an empty office the next morning. He left behind a single note taped to the station wall. It was never about a stone. It was about everything that stone threatened to reveal. J.D. Nobody missed him, but the town changed. Eden Falls, once a place where silence was tradition, now buzzed with conversation. Churches hosted veterans panels. The high school installed a memorial wall in the gymnasium, including every local service member, regardless of race or era. The city council passed a resolution requiring transparency in all veteran records and offered reparations to families who had lost burial rights due to administrative prejudice. Luther didn't care about reparations. He wanted truth, and slowly it came. A year after the ceremony in D.C., Luther received a box in the mail. No return address. Inside, an old cassette tape, a field journal, and one photograph. The tape was labeled Hugh 71. The journal, worn and smudge-smailed, had a name written in pencil. Lieutenant Robert Malcolm Hargrove. He died 6 months after the operation in Hugh. But this tape, it had his voice. Luther sat down with Elaine and pressed play. April 3rd, 1971. If this ever gets heard, let it be known Calvin Dane didn't just save a squad, he saved a town. The intel he brought back uncovered 3 Viet Cong storage points, 2 officer positions, and prevented the bombing of a civilian hospital by friendly fire. He was the reason we made it out. And when the mission went wrong, when command denied we were ever there, he stayed behind so the rest of us could evacuate. He gave them the time they needed. He knew he wouldn't come back, and he went anyway. Elaine turned off the tape. Luther didn't speak for a long time. Then he whispered, "That's the eulogy he never got." 2 months later, the town gathered again. this time in front of the newly renamed Dane Memorial Center. Elaine spoke first, then Luther, then a boy no one expected. 15-year-old Terence Moore, great-grandson of one of Calvin's childhood friends. He stepped up to the mic, voice cracking with nerves, and said, "They told me once that heroes wear capes. I believed them, until I met Mr. Dane, and I saw what a real hero leaves behind. Not a cape, but a name, a truth, and a stone nobody can trip over anymore because we made sure it stood." The crowd stood in silence, then applause, then tears. And at the cemetery, as dusk fell, a child walked by with his father. He paused in front of Calvin's grave. "Who was he, Dad?" the boy asked. The father smiled. "A man who didn't need a monument to matter, but got one anyway, because someone refused to let him be forgotten."